This is video 4.5.2, and the goal is to transform functions of sine and cosine. So let's take a look. So on the left here is the notes that you're going to take into your pink sheet, and then we'll do two examples. So they will take a little while because I'll over-explain things, but you may get the hang of this quicker than others, so feel free to fast forward if you think you know how to do this. So first of all, what we've hopefully realized through our investigation is that A is the amplitude. A is what affects the amplitudes, the number timesing by the cosine or sine function. So A is our amplitude, but it's really the absolute value of A, because amplitude will never be negative. So it's always going to be a positive value. So it's really the size of A, not actually A. The second thing, that works, of course, for sine and cosine. So we're going to have to do these at the same time for the most part. Period. Again, period is going to be the same for sine and cosine. And what we're going to look at is the B value. The B value is the period factor. It is not the period. B is not the period. B is the period factor. It affects the period. Now, how does it affect the period? Well, normally the period is 2 pi. So to get the period for both sine and cosine, we do 2 pi divided by B. Because B really represents how many periods would occur in one normal period. So that's why we divide, because we want to see what one period equals. So your period will always be 2 pi divided by the B value for both sine and cosine. Starting point. First of all, the h and k value in both these general rules represent the shift. They're telling me how much I picked the graph up and moved it up and over, or left and right and up and down. H is always left and right, k is up and down, just like we've always done it for every function we've looked at this year. H and k shift the graph. So for sine, that's easy, because sine, if we remember, sine starts at 0, 0. So now it's simply going to start at hk, because we're going to lift it to h and k. So hk is your starting point for sine. So sine is actually the easy one, but cosine is the harder one. Because cosine, we have to remember, starts up at the maximum. So that dotted line represents kind of the midline. Typically it was our x-axis if we don't shift the graph. But if we shift the graph, we're going to shift everything up and over hk. But our max is normally up a from that midline. So that means my starting point for cosine is h comma k plus a. And the h is because it's still going to be over at h, but the k plus a is because it's k plus the amplitude, because we're starting up at the maximum value. We're starting at the amplitude plus k. So that's just something you're going to have to memorize to help you understand this. But we'll talk more about some other strategies if this doesn't work for you, some other ways to help you graph these functions. So that's how you find those three key things. But now we have to find the key points. So we're going to add a lot more to this notes down here in the key points section, because there are 5 key points for both these graphs. We found the starting point for each of them. But let's focus in on sine and how to find the other key points. So for sine, next we're going to find the end point. And what we need to remember is that it's 1 period away from the beginning. So we simply go 1 period away. Starting the graph is never a bad idea, because you can see that. But what it means is we're simply going to keep it at k, because it's still going to be up at the same level, but the h is going to be adding 1 period. So that's why it's important to find your p-value. You'll always do h plus p. The next thing that we're going to find is the middle point. The middle point, we have to remember, on the sine wave is at the same level as the other two, that third green point there. And it's going to be half a period away. So it's going to be right in the middle of the period. So we add half the period. So now it's h plus p divided by 2 comma k. We add half the period. So those are the 3 key points that tend to be the easiest for sine. The other 2 points can be a little tricky, especially when we start to switch up our a value, because the other 2 points depend on the a value. So I'm going to give you a rule for each of them, because I think it's important for those of us that like rules. The rule for the P2, the second point in my sine curve, first of all, the k value should be a little bit easier to understand, that we add a because we're adding an amplitude. We're going up in amplitude. The other part, though, what we're doing with h plus p over 4 is we're adding 1/4 of the period, because it's 1/4 along the cycle. So we're adding 1/4 the period to get the other h value. To get the x value, excuse me. So that's why we do h plus p over 4. The second point is equally tricky, but it has the same exact idea. When we do the next point, we're simply going to go down the amplitude, So we'll end up going for P4, we'll be adding 3/4 of the period first of all, so 3P over 4. But now we're going to do K minus A because we go down the amplitude because that's typically your minimum point. So that's a rule for you, but some of us, I personally am not very good at memorizing rules. I'm much more visual. So to talk about the visual understanding, I'm going to erase these rules. You can write them down if you think you'll use them and they'll help you. But the visual understanding is literally that everything's right in the middle. So P2 and P4 are in the middle of those green points that we initially started. And the second thing we need to remember is that we add and subtract the amplitudes to find the value. For P2, when we're finding P2, we're going to add the amplitude. When we're finding P4, we're always going to subtract for P4. That's just the key. So that's as simple as it gets. We always add for the first amplitude, then we subtract for the next point. It's always the case. And I really should clarify, I'm sorry, we're not adding the amplitude, we're actually adding the A value. Add and subtract the A value. Now, what does that mean? That's the visual understanding of it. And when we start to graph it, I think you'll understand where I'm coming from with that point. Now, cosine. Cosine. First of all, we're going to do the same thing for the endpoint. We're simply going to add on a period. Notice that K plus A stays the same, but the H adds on P because we're going to shift it over to P, one period away. The bottom point, the minimum, it's at the middle of the period, so we add H plus P over 2. We're going to add half the period. And then we're going to go down the amplitude from the K value. So instead of going up like we did for the first 2 points we found, we're going to go down to find the minimum point. Should make sense because the amplitude, that's how far away it is from the midline. Midline is at K. Now the next 2 key points are a little bit trickier, but really again the visual understanding is the best way to think about this. So the next 2 points, P4 and P2, first of all they're both at K, because they're both right in the middle. So they're both at the midline, K. So that's the easy part. They're going to be at level K. Now, where are they at as far as X? Well, again, they're 1/4 and they're 3/4 of the way along. But what I like to think about is that they're in the middle. So if we can find midpoints, we can find these values. They're literally in the middle of the 2 points we just found. They're in the middle of, P through is in the middle of these 2 points. They go right in the middle. So if I had the numbers, I could quickly find the middle of those numbers, and that would be where P2 is. But for a rule, for you rule people, it's simply H plus P over 4. Add 1/4 of the period. And for the other one, it's 3/4 of the period, because it's 3/4 of the way along the graph. So those are the rules and kind of the understanding of the symmetry and the kind of values that happen along the graphs. So let's take a look at some examples to make sense of these notes. So we're looking at sine. The first thing we need to notice for this example is that it's not written in standard form. That's key. In order to graph the function using these notes, we need to have it written in the same way as the notes. So first we're going to start by factoring out the pi. So we factor pi out and we have x minus 2 on the inside. I factored out the pi, divided each of those terms by pi in the orange there. Now I can see all my values. So now I'm going to find the amplitude, the A value. It's the absolute value of A. In this case, A is -1 because minus sine means -1 sine, so -1 is your A value. So my amplitude is 1. Now my period is affected by the period factor B. It's 2 pi divided by B. In our case, the B value is pi, so we're going to do 2 pi divided by pi and get 2. And that's my period value. 2 is my period, so every 2 units this cycle will continue and repeat itself. The next thing we're going to find is the starting point. Remember, this is the easy one for sine. It's just HK. So in our case, H is 2 and K is actually 4. It's out in front in this case. I could have rewritten it in standard form, but it's really the number being added or subtracted on the outside, and it's a positive 4 on the outside. So 4 is my K value. So I'm going to start at 2, 4. I have a period of 2 and an amplitude of 1. Seems easy, right? So now we're going to graph it. I like to make a little sketch off to the side, and then I'll put key points. Now some of you may not use graph paper, so this is how you'll draw your picture. You may only draw what I draw here. I'll also draw the graph on the graph paper. So finding all the key points, it's 5 key points total. Start with your starting point, 2, 4. The next point you find, just like we talked about in the notes, is the ending point, because it's 1 period away. Our period is 2 units, so I'm going to go 2 units from 2, 4 to 4, 4. I'm adding 2 to the x value. The next thing I find is the one right in the middle. So what's exactly in the middle of 2, 4 and 4, 4? Well, 3, 4 is right in the middle because it's really the middle of 2 and 4, 3. So they're all along the same level at y equals 4, but it's 2, 3, and 4 with a total period of 2. So hopefully this makes sense so far. Now, before I find the maximum and the minimum points by adding a and subtracting a like we talked about, I'm actually going to start the graph. So I'm going to set up the graph. So take a moment to join me and do that. Then I'm going to start to use my visual ideas. So I'm going to take from that starting point 2, 4, and I'm going to add a. Now remember, a is actually -1. So if I add -1, I'm actually going to go down 1. So that means from this point, 2, 4, I'm going to go down 1 and go to the middle. Remember, it's in the middle, like we talked about. So it's in the middle, down 1. The next point, of course, we're going to add a, subtract a, but subtracting -1 really makes me go up 1. So I end up having this curve that's kind of flipped over from the normal sign. So this graph that I originally drew is actually not quite accurate because it doesn't go up and then down. It actually goes down and then up. And that key is because the a value was negative. So because the a was negative, the graph went down first and then went up. It flipped the graph. So now I'm going to simply copy and paste those same exact points to the right in order to create a longer curve, add some arrows, and I'm done with my graph. So we typically want to draw 2 periods just so we can see that it repeats and make sure it looks symmetrical and all that jazz. So there is your graph of the first example. Let's do one more example before your checkpoints. So we have the notes here again so that we can use them to help us with the cosine graph. Now we're looking at the cosine values, especially the starting point and the key points, which are all different for cosine. So first we have to find the amplitude, period, and starting point. Amplitude, before I can do any of this though, remember you want to write it in standard form. So I'm factoring out a 2, which really means I'm dividing each of those terms, 2x plus pi divided by 2, take out the 2. This is the equivalent form of the function after factoring out 2. Now I'm going to find the amplitude, which is just the absolute value of the a value. A is 2 in this case, and I get an amplitude of 2. The period is always 2 pi divided by the b. The b value is the period factor, so I find b. b is 2, so I'm going to do 2 pi divided by 2 to get the period. So the period is pi in this case. Next up, I'm going to find the starting point. So looking back at my notes, I see the starting point is always h comma k plus a. So in this case, h is negative pi over 2. Notice that it's plus pi over 2, so that really means x minus negative pi over 2. So h is negative, and the k value is also -1. So to find the starting point, I do h comma k plus a. So a is 2, so I'm going to do h, negative pi over 2, comma, -1 plus 2. And that's how I get my starting value of negative pi over 2, comma 1. So I have my starting point. Now I got to find the final key points. So I'm finding 5 points altogether. I draw a quick sketch so I can start to visualize this. After I find the first point, I always find the ending point, and the ending point is a period away. Our period is 1 pi, so I'm going to do negative pi over 2 plus pi to land at pi over 2. I'm still up at 1. Notice the y value is still 1 because I'm still at the maximum of my graph. Now, how do I find the minimum? Well, the minimum is in the middle, first of all. So first I find the middle. The middle is the middle of the negative pi over 2 and the pi over 2. What's exactly in the middle? Well, 0 is exactly in the middle. Now I'm going to find and use the amplitude to find the k value. The y value. And I'm going to use the k value and do k minus a. Remember your notes to the left there. That's the rule. I'm going to take the k value and take away the amplitude. So the k value was -1, and I'm going to take away 2 because that's the amplitude. -1 minus 2 gives me -3. So that's my minimum value. Now I'm going to graph it and kind of just make sure I like the sketch, and I'm going to check everything also as I go. So again, I'm going to graph it. I typically graph after 3 points just because it's a lot easier to find those middle points after that. So I'm going to set up my graph, plot the 3 points that I know. I start to see the U forming, so that looks good so far. Now the next thing I'm going to do is find those middle points. So remember, those next P2 and P4 are in the middle, literally in the middle of the 2 3 points that I've graphed that make a V right now. So I find the middle in the x direction by noticing that those blue dotted lines are the middle of those 2 red points, each of those pairs of red points. So it's actually going to be at negative pi over 4 and pi over 4. The next thing I do is find the middle of the y values, which is at negative 1. So that's the points that's exactly in the middle. Now I am going to check my work. I'm going to finish my sketch just so I can better see my amplitude and such. I see my amplitude is 2 like it should be, so that's a good sign. And I also would check my period and make sure that my period, that from start to end, it's always going to be a total of pi, and I see that works there as well. So double check your graph, make sure all those little pieces fit, especially for those middle points. Use the middle points to help check your amplitude. So now you're on to your checkpoints. So here's your questions for your checkpoint online. Do your best to find the period for the function in the multiple choice question, and then in the free response, try to list the 5 key points. They should be reasonably nice. You shouldn't have to have pi in them. So if you're careful about how you do this work, it should be fairly easy. But you know what I'm realizing? That I forgot one thing. So change the rule to 8 pi. So hopefully you're still listening, but make sure you put an 8 pi there. Otherwise, it will be uglier numbers than I would like. So do your best, find those key points, and find the period. Bring your questions into class, and we look forward to going over this with you.